Player agency is often described as the ability for players to make meaningful choices. The players decide where to go. They decide what risks to take. They decide how their characters respond to the world. But agency at the table rarely feels meaningful simply because choices exist. In many games, players are technically free to choose anything. Yet those choices feel strangely inconsequential, because meaningful agency does not come from the number of options available. It comes from the consequences that follow those options. When decisions reshape the situation, players begin to feel the pressure of those decisions. And that pressure is what gives agency its weight. One of the most common failures of player agency appears when choices exist, but the outcome of those choices never truly changes the situation. Players may choose between several paths, but each path eventually leads to the same destination. From the outside, the players appear to have freedom, but from the inside, the structure of the game remains fixed. In one campaign, the players spent a long time deciding whether to investigate the docks or the old church. Both locations appeared suspicious. After a lengthy debate, the group finally chose the docks. But when they arrived, they eventually discovered that the events they were investigating would have unfolded exactly the same way if they had gone to the church instead. The choice had existed, but the consequences of the choice had not. Agency becomes fragile when the structure of the game cannot absorb different decisions. If every path leads to the same result, players eventually recognize that their decisions carry very little weight. Stable agency appears when the world responds to player decisions. Different actions should create different pressures. Even small decisions can reshape the situation when the world remembers them. Players often feel that they have agency simply because they're allowed to make decisions. They can choose where to go, who to trust, and what risks to take. But agency is not defined by the number of options available. Agency appears when the world changes because of the decisions players make. If every path leads to the same outcome, players eventually realize that their choices do not actually shape the situation. The game may still move forward, but the structure of the world remains fixed. Real agency appears when different choices create different pressures, because meaningful decisions are not defined by freedom. They are defined by consequence. Another failure of agency occurs when consequences exist, but players cannot see them. A decision may change the world in subtle ways, but if the players never recognize that change, the decision still feels meaningless. In one investigation, the players chose to trust a nervous witness rather than press for more information. The decision seemed minor at the time. Later, that witness disappeared, and the players eventually discovered that their earlier decision had allowed an important suspect to escape. The consequence existed, but because the connection was not immediately visible, the players did not initially realize the importance of the choice. Agency depends on players recognizing the connection between decisions and outcomes. When consequences remain invisible, the structure of the game hides the impact of those choices. Stable agency appears when consequences become visible over time. Patterns begin to emerge. Players recognize that earlier decisions continue to shape the situation. And once that pattern becomes visible, decisions begin to feel much more significant. Consequences only create agency when players can recognize them. A decision might change the situation in subtle ways, but if players never see the results of that decision, the choice still feels meaningless. Agency depends on pattern recognition. Players begin to understand that their earlier decisions continue shaping what happens later. A person they trusted disappears. A problem they ignored becomes more serious. A choice made several sessions earlier quietly alters the direction of the story. When players begin to see those patterns emerge, they start treating every decision more carefully, because they understand that the world remembers what they chose. A third failure appears when the game presents danger without lasting consequences. Players may face difficult situations. They may take risks, but when those risks never reshape the situation, tension disappears. In one campaign, the players repeatedly confronted dangerous encounters, but every time something went wrong, the consequences were quickly reversed. Allies arrived to help. Problems were quietly resolved. And by the next session, the situation looked almost exactly the same. The risks had been real, but their consequences had been temporary. Agency becomes meaningful when decisions create pressure that persists. If the situation constantly resets, decisions lose their impact. Stable agency emerges when the world continues evolving after a decision is made. Players begin to see that the structure of the campaign changes based on their actions. And when those changes accumulate, decisions begin to feel significant. Agency rarely appears in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it emerges slowly as consequences accumulate over time. One decision changes the situation slightly. Another decision adds pressure. A third decision closes off options that were once available. Eventually, the players realize that the world they are navigating is the result of their earlier choices. This is when agency becomes meaningful. Not when players are given freedom, but when the campaign structure begins reflecting the decisions that they have already made. Because meaningful choices is measured in consequences that continue shaping the future. Player agency is often described as freedom, but freedom alone rarely creates meaningful decisions. Agency appears when choice reshapes the structure of the situation, when decisions produce visible consequences, when those consequences accumulate over time, because players do not experience agency through the option they are given. They experience it through the world that emerges from the decisions they make.